Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series, weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law. This is a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Health Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box. You can answer those anytime during the webinar. Just do know that we hold those questions until the end. We do try to get to as many as possible, but it's usually not possible to get to all of those. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat box shortly. And if you are pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will be a link in the chat box, but that'll come in the later points of the presentation. So keep an eye on the chat box as we get closer to the end of the presentation for your link to the continuing education survey. Make sure you open that link and make sure it works for you before you exit the webinar. If it's not working for you at that time, make sure that you copy and paste and save that link for later use, and make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey because we don't have access to those after the fact. A recording and the PowerPoint slides for this talk should be available sometime later this week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Sarah Millspaugh, who will be discussing the use and administration of performance validity tests for people that are suspected of low intellectual functioning. But I'd like to circle back to this week. I'm honored and excited to introduce you to today's speaker. Who'll be discussing some technology use considerations and updates on considerations of technology in criminal legal contexts. This is Dr. Ashley Batastini. Dr. Batastini is an associate professor in the Center for Forensic Behavioral Science at Swinburne University of Technology. Her work broadly focuses on novel intervention strategies for higher-risk populations and ways to improve access to appropriate services at various stages of legal involvement. Her work's been funded by the U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration and the American Psychological Foundation. She's also the recipient of several early career honors, including the Early Career Achievement Award by Division 18 for Psychologists in Public Service, and the Salim Shah Early Career Award from Division 41, the American Psychology Law Society, with the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. She's also currently a member of APA's Office of Healthcare Innovation Advisory Committee for Mental Health Technology, and recently co-chaired the APLS Telepsychology Task Force. She's a licensed practicing psychologist specializing in criminal forensic mental health evaluations. And I'll say, as a personal side, I've long come to admire Dr. Batastini's approach to how to effectively and compassionately deliver behavioral health services to incarcerated individuals and those that are involved in the legal system broadly. So Dr. Batastini, Ashley, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, it's an honor to have you joining the series again. Thankful for you sharing your expertise and also your willingness to get up ridiculously early, your Australia time, to do something like this for all of us. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. And I just find it a testament to the topic for today that I'm projecting to you from Melbourne, Australia. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, which I realize is maybe a normal functioning hour for a lot of folks on this call, but it is not a typical time that I'm awake. But I mean, how cool is that we get to hang out this morning together? There's a little over 450 people on this call, and it's all in real time. Hopefully there aren't too many technological glitches, but the state of technology today is allowing us to do this, even though we're from all parts of the world. So I think that's pretty exciting. All right, so there's some beginning information here about continuing education credits. I'll have a QR code, and I know Anthony and the team will post some information towards the end about doing your evaluation so that you can get the completion certificate for CE credits if that's what you're interested in obtaining from today. A couple other announcements. So I don't have any financial interests to disclose. I'm not here on behalf of big tech or anything like that, just sharing some knowledge about this and how it applies to our work. The views that are expressed in this presentation are mine, and they don't necessarily represent the views, policies, or positions of the University of Mexico. I'll offer a secondary disclaimer and tell you that I probably probably have way too many slides and we probably won't get through everything that I intended to get through today, but we'll get as far as we can and then have some time for questions at the end, and you'll have these slides to reference later, even if we don't get to certain material. But okay, so I wanted to start and just kind of get on the same page in terms of what we mean by technology. And this is a little paragraph taken from the 2013 guidelines for the practice of telepsychology from APA. So I think when we talk about technology, and the last time I talked about this topic, it was mostly in reference to video conferencing technology. So Zoom, things that we're kind of used to engaging with on a day-to-day basis. So again, that was the kind of the modality of focus when I talked about tech back in March 2022. And I know there's been some other technology-focused topics since then. But I think it's important to remember that technology does encompass a much wider range of technology-based services. Even last week, Randy Otto talked about social media. That's a form of technology that is impacting the work that we do. And I would say, and this is more anecdotal, just based off of my own observations, that other sectors of mental health are a bit more advanced in terms of integrating technology into service provision than we tend to be in psychology and law. So, because I don't expect people to remember the talk back in 2022, or there's probably lots of people on this tuning in today on this call who weren't present for that. And so I just wanted to offer a quick recap so we're all kind of starting from the same level. So the last time I talked about this, we covered the empirical perspective of forensic telepractice. We focused particularly on the impact of COVID-19 and how that impacted our work. We talked about shifts towards remote evaluations. I talked about the lack of controlled studies. We have some, but not very many, and the implications for forensic experts in court. We also talked about research findings on the effectiveness of telepractice, perceptions of remote evaluations in court. This is a big area of research, and potential challenges and considerations. And we discussed the continued need for telepractice even after COVID-19, or after the impacts of COVID-19 have kind of slowed down a bit. And we talked about recommendations for assessment, treatment, testimony, and training. And then, as most presentations do, we concluded with some future directions and references and the like. So the reason that I wanted to revisit this is a couple things. I hope to accomplish a few of these. One is to update folks on new and emerging research and some resources that have come out since 2022. I also want to try to emphasize some continued areas of development and research. We still have many areas of need in terms of research that have not been addressed since 2022. So there are a few stuck points. I wanted to talk, and this is kind of similar to what I mentioned a few slides ago. I wanted to expand our discussion of technological applications, not just focusing on video conferencing and not just focusing on forensic mental health evaluation. And then I also hope to showcase some novel initiatives in the clinical practice of psychology and law. Obviously, this is a lot to cover in the 45-50 minutes that I have today, but the goal really is to bring some awareness about the various ways that technology is being leveraged to improve our practices in psychology law. Tess Neal talked about psychology law as a broader field in her article in the American Psychologist, which I think was published in 2018. And she talks about forensic psychology and correctional psychology as being distinct but overlapping fields, right? And this is probably not new to anybody on this call, but we kind of think of the forensic psychology as the application of psychological principles to resolve legal issues, contractual issues, administrative matters, whereas correctional psychology is the application of psychological principles to inform things like classification of people with offending behaviors, treatment, management, and where our goal is to reduce risk and improve public safety. And I mention this because I think there is a tendency for us to talk about forensic and correctional psychology separately sometimes, despite their overlapping, some of the ways in which they overlap, especially when it comes to the criminal matters. And civil forensic matters are kind of quite separate from correctional issues. But by discussing them separately, I think we sometimes miss opportunities to learn from what's going on in these respective areas. And I think that can be particularly true when it comes to advances in technology. So I'm going to kind of talk about forensic and correctional psychology at the same time in this presentation. Obviously, technology can be applied anywhere along the continuum of criminal legal involvement. We're seeing a lot of research and talk about technological advances in law enforcement and crime scene analysis. So things like virtual reality for training. We were seeing things like robotic cameras for surveillance. You might have, some college campuses have robotic patrols, those little kind of, I don't know, Wall-E looking things that patrol around the campus. Another controversial area is AI crime forecasting. And there's a lot of pushback on the algorithms that are being used to predict where crime is occurring, that are leading to some potential racial bias and discrimination. That could be a whole other webinar on its own. But again, I kind of want to focus on the later stages of criminal legal involvement. So mostly from about pretrial on. Okay, so some of what we'll talk about is more specific to forensic issues, some is more specific to correctional, and some has overlap or at least some generalizability across these areas. Now, I wanted to start with an update on video conferencing in forensic mental health services. I know I said I wanted to expand our discussion of that, but because this was the main focus of the last presentation, I wanted to provide a bit of an update, since the whole purpose of this is to kind of revisit and update you on the literature base here. So as I mentioned a few slides back, examiner perceptions of use was a pretty heavy area, relatively speaking, in terms of research, where people were putting out surveys for forensic examiners and asking them, how did they, do they like this? How often are they using this in their practice? And so this is a very cursory summary of the progression of this line of research. So before COVID hit us, my team and I put out, I think, the first survey of examiner use of video conferencing, and sort of the overall sentiment was, we don't really like the idea. We're kind of hesitant about it. We have some concerns, but the people who had done it before had less concern. So it seems fine once you do it, but overall, we're not that excited about it. And then during COVID, or right after the onset of COVID-19, we saw a couple other surveys come out looking at, again, have there been changes in the usage, changes in perceptions? And at this time, again, this is my sort of summary read of the literature. The sentiment was, we still have some concerns, but it's okay. We kind of don't really have much of a choice anyway. And then another study came out in 2023 that I thought was really interesting, and it suggested that there's been quite a bit of a shift in terms of people's perceptions, and that some people will actually like it better, like doing video conferencing evaluations better than they like doing in person. So I'm going to quote something from the abstract of this paper that was in a special issue of Behavioral Sciences in the Law. It said a striking 43.7% of respondents preferred video conferencing for forensic mental health assessment over in-person evaluation, and another 22.5% expressed no preference between the modalities. And then they further noted that nearly 70% of respondents denied there were any populations for which they would never use video conferencing to complete a forensic evaluation. So I thought that was kind of an interesting shift, that we went from, we really don't like it, we're kind of disgruntled about it, to, it's kind of nice doing this. I can, wear my bottom half of my pajamas and still see somebody and get my work done and be home with my dog. Or maybe that's just me. Another area in forensic psychology that we're kind of seeing more technology, especially the video conferencing piece, is for remote competency restoration. So this is being delivered primarily in jails to help reduce the pretrial incarceration rate. While people, there's kind of this backlog of people waiting for inpatient psychiatric bed space. And so maybe we can start getting them restored to competency while they're in jail. And maybe we can expedite that even further by using remote services. And there's at least one study out there looking at some outcomes related to remote competency restoration. So Lewis et al., this was a paper published in a special issue in Criminal Justice and Behavior on Technology. And they showed that the remote competency restoration, people who participated in that, had faster restoration times than the pre-pandemic match sample where they were doing in-person competency restoration, but they didn't show fewer days incarcerated. So, and they predicted that this might not have been a result of the methods used, but that the sample that they collected was fairly shortly after the onset of COVID-19. And so many of the jails might have still been dealing with delays in implementing pandemic-related procedures. So it may be the case that if we were to look at this again, that the remote jail-based competency restoration folks would also have shorter incarceration stays. Obviously, the research in this particular area is still limited, but this approach is being discussed a bit more widely as an alternative. And Lauren Koisa is actually spearheading a Bureau of Justice Assistance program in Alabama that has a remote restoration component. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcome of that project. And some of you may be involved in these kinds of services already. Okay, so also related to, I realize I'm kind of just hitting the highlights of some of these things. Another area that is coming to light in terms of assessment service is the use of machine learning in violence risk prediction. There's been quite a bit of momentum in this area. So it's not really related to video conferencing per se, but it is related to assessment services, okay? So machine learning, again, very cursory overview of this, is basically the use of computer-generated algorithms to predict a given outcome, okay? And so as you might expect, if you're familiar with violence risk prediction tools, they're doing a similar thing that our existing tools do, where they're taking static dynamic factors for known case and typically a large number of known cases, and that information is being used to predict a person's risk classification. And usually it's a categorical approach. So they're looking at discrete risk classes like low risk, medium risk, high risk, although there's been a few that I've seen that look at a probabilistic estimate, but most of the time they kind of clunk people into risk bins. And the obvious intent, I think, is to improve accuracy, improve objectivity, transparency, and reliability in making forensic clinical decisions. Again, this is an emerging area, but this is a systematic review from 2022, and they were able to review 8 studies. And overall, they found that the machine learning algorithm generated a better prediction model than structured violence risk assessment instruments in predicting violent episodes. The limitation here was that, and they noted this in the paper, is that there was just a high variability in terms of experimental procedures, the specific outcomes tested, and the sample characteristics. So I think that kind of muddied the waters a little bit, in addition to only looking at 8 studies. Others have kind of questioned whether machine learning can lead to bias, right? And the question is that, it can, of course, right? Anything that we do in our practice has the potential to lead to bias. And there's one study this was a study done in Spain. They looked at hundreds of youth cases. And again, they found that while the machine learning algorithm achieved a higher predictive power than using the traditional SAVRE tool, it did show some gender and ethnic disparities. So more often it was incorrectly classifying men and foreign nationals as recidivists. So again, this is a study done in Spain. We also have the problem that, the inequality of base rates to begin with might partially explain these disparities. So if something is happening more often to a certain population or a certain group of people, then that might end up being built into the prediction model. But again, we kind of have these issues arising in our traditional risk assessment tools anyway. Okay, so I think the question, and this is not something that we're going to answer today, but is the bias that is associated with machine learning mechanisms greater than bias from traditional methods of risk assessment? So I don't know, perhaps machine learning algorithms can be more easily perfected and improved than human judgment, even when our professional judgment is guided by a tool. Who knows? I don't know. But again, this is still an emerging area of exploration. We do at least, we are now starting to see discussions about the ethical use of AI and these machine learning mechanisms in violence risk assessment. So if you're interested in learning more about this and where this is going, you might be interested to check this particular article out. This slide is very similar to a slide that I had in my presentation in 2022, because again, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of research. I think that we need more in terms of perceptions and experiences using technology in different contexts. So I talked about these two studies last time as well, and these were studies out of my research team. Jones looked at the credibility of virtual testimony. So does it matter, does your credibility get impacted if you testify virtually or not? And then Lord looked at, this is a paper that's under review for publication. She looked at the credibility when testifying about a virtual evaluation. So in other words, she tried to answer the question of whether conducting an evaluation remotely would impact your credibility in court. So does it make you look less credible if you've done an evaluation remotely? But those are only two studies in two different contexts. And so it'd be helpful to have more of that kind of stuff. We also need more research on whether these technologies lead to differential outcomes. Triage, treatment planning, do they lead to different psycholegal opinions, court decisions? So moving beyond just perceptions of things, but what actually changes in the real world? I also think it'd be interesting to do some work on differences in practice standards, right? I'm going to mention some recommendations that came out since 2022 that I was lucky to be part of, but we still don't really have a good consensus of what does the profession think is minimally required in terms of doing video conferenced evaluations or using other forms of technology in their practice. We also need a lot more on cultural and diversity factors and ways to actually prevent biased outcomes. So for example, what is the impact of the role of interpreters, or how can we use technology to better accommodate people with disability needs or those kinds of things? And of course, we need more studies using random assignment in larger samples. This is something else that I talked about before. This is a good example of a paper that I think we need more of in the criminal forensics and corrections side of things. This is a study that examined compensation and pension evaluations for PTSD among veterans. So it kind of has a forensic-y component to it. But they took masked raters, and those people coded reports for content and quality, right? So they looked at what variables were being discussed in these reports. Did those reports lead to different opinions about disability? And so this is something that I haven't come across in the criminal legal side of things, but would be a really interesting study. Fran Lexon and Gina Mangun-Amir's work from 2006 and 2007 are still the only randomized studies that I know that looked at reliability of remote versus in-person competency testing. So we really need more work in that respect. This is a personal opinion of mine, but I don't think that we need any more surveys of forensic examiners, at least not right now. I think we've got a good sense of how forensic practitioners view these things and how often they're using them. I do, however, think we need more surveys that include judges, attorneys, the actual defendants themselves, and whether they view these assessments as valid. Are they, getting quality services, for example, in terms of the restoration? Are they viewing, are legal parties viewing it as admissible in court? Under what circumstances, what barriers? I mean, I'll still get attorneys. I'm sure people still have this experience too, where they'll say, I really want you to see this guy in person. And it's like, well, why? What makes that person particularly in need of an in-person evaluation? And it just, to me, kind of suggests that there might still be some biases out there from legal professionals about the use of those kinds of technologies. Okay, so beyond evaluation, I want to talk a little bit about the rise of digital tech in rehabilitation. So we're starting to see things like in-cell tablet computers for people in prison, mobile apps. My team and I are involved in the development of an app for people in community supervision. We're seeing things like interactive gaming, web-based programs, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about virtual reality tools that are now being used. And I think VR in particular is increasing on the correctional side of things because it's a way to simulate more in-depth and more immersive experiences that either can't be recreated or they would be kind of dangerous to recreate. So for example, people who tend to react to situations really violently, or they have violent tendencies, they could engage in those situations and really be able to work through some of their aggression and some of those associated thought processes. They could test out new problem solving options. They could adapt new coping skills without the risk of harming other people. And I feel like I would be remiss not to talk about some of the work in my new home country of Australia, particularly in New South Wales, which is where Sydney is located. And there's a really big, and I think a cool push to enhance digital tech in prisons. And so this is just a snapshot from an 84-page strategic plan that was published in 2021, highlighting some of the areas in which they want to use digital technology to help advance their research and development in these particular areas of rehabilitation. And they actually, I thought this was pretty cool too. They just ended a call. I'm sad that I missed it, but they just ended a call for research proposals from external collaborators. So basically they published this strategic plan and then they opened the door and said, we want to work with you. What ideas do you have to use these technologies to improve these different areas for people who are under our correctional custody? And so people from universities or industry agencies could submit proposals to get started and helping the corrections system in New South Wales to implement some of these technologies, which I thought was pretty cool. This is a website that I came across when I was preparing for this talk that talks about an international effort across multiple countries in Europe and how they're using virtual reality training in prisons to enhance education and rehabilitation. And so they talk, and this isn't a research study, but they do talk in this report about, generally positive feedback during pilot testing. Even the UN is talking about this. So this is a screenshot from their website on crime and justice. They're the Crime and Justice Research Institute. And actually was able to meet somebody here in Australia who was part of drafting a report to the UN, which I think will hopefully come out shortly. But I just think it's interesting that this is rising to these large international levels. But this stuff isn't brand new. Okay, so the articles have been out since at least the mid-2000s talking about virtual reality for prison programming. This is one example here, talking about new possibilities in research, training, and rehabilitation in terms of virtual reality. And I want to show you, I think it's helpful to kind of visualize how virtual reality, how virtual reality can look in a prison environment. So this is a clip from Vice from the Colorado Department of Corrections. I think this was filmed about 6 years ago, or at least that's when the posting was on YouTube. So I'm going to show you this clip because, again, I think this is the kind of stuff that's really helpful to visualize what this actually looks like and how this might be helpful. Oops. No. All right, hold on. I'm going to go restart.
These 6 men were convicted of murder as teens in the 80s and 90s, so they've never even used smartphones. This year, Colorado created a program to make certain longtime inmates eligible for early release using virtual.
Oh, it's not, is it moving? It's not moving, is it?
Yeah, Ashley, we can hear that audio, but we can't see the video, or the video isn't playing.
Hang on, let me try one more time.
These 6 men were convicted of murder as teens in the 80s and 90s, so they've never even used smartphones. This year, Colorado created a program to make certain
it's
longtime.
Of course, technology. We're talking about technology and it's not gonna. Hang on, let me just see if I can. No. All right.
These 6 men were convicted of murder as teens.
I don't know how I can move it. Okay, I might move on and maybe put a link to it in the chat box, or maybe we could circle back to it if there's time at the end. Does that work?
Yeah, I'll share the link in the chat for the attendees now.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know, maybe there's an Australian glitch or something. I don't know, but all right, we'll move on. I think this is a pretty cool video. So if you do have a chance to watch it, I think it does really show some of the ways in which VR is being used for education and kind of reentry services and sort of getting a sense of, you know, how these technologies can be used to help prepare people for some of the interactions that they will have in the outside world that they may not have had for a long time while they've been incarcerated behind bars. Okay, so this is another more recent study, or I guess not really a study, this is more of a commentary, where they're now talking more about the integration of other incarcerated folks. This one's focused particularly on women, looking at virtual reality in prisons and how the inclusion of these individuals would be helpful in terms of the development of the technologies in the first place. So how can we better address the needs of incarcerated people in the actual development and design of virtual reality on the front end of things? So the question I think then becomes, you know, are these programs effective? So there's lots of talk about doing these things. And if you get a chance to watch that Vice video, you'll see some of the guys talking about how they really like the VR and how it seems like it's very helpful to them. There's a difference between getting perceptions and getting an actual understanding of whether these programs lead to the outcomes that we would want them to lead to. So these are a couple initial studies on virtual reality and starting to look at more of the outcomes that we would be interested in seeing. So this is a study of VR where they had men convicted of domestic violence offenses who were immersed in a full body ownership illusion. Okay, so they were kind of in the VR world. They had the physical bodies of a life-sized virtual woman. Okay, and they, you know, they could move synchronously with that AI's body movements and all of those things. And then following the VR simulation, the men were, the results that they reported in here, the men were better able to identify fearful faces on women, and they were less likely to misidentify fearful faces as happy, things that, you know, might lead to domestic violence outcomes. So, you know, again, they're starting to look at these initial impacts of VR or VR programming on people's thoughts and behaviors, but whether this actually ends up reducing cases of domestic violence is something that remains to be seen. This is another one that came out looking at forensic psychiatric inpatients, and this was a nice randomized controlled trial. And what they found was that the virtual reality elements did not reduce self-reported or observed aggression, but there were some shorter term impacts that were noted. So people were, in the short term, people were able to control their anger, impulsivity, and feelings of hostility, but unfortunately that didn't kind of generalize to longer term outcomes. So a study like this, maybe could be used to argue that it's really not worth pursuing virtual reality in this way, but it could also mean that we just need more improved technology, or that the underlying content of the intervention might need to be improved, not necessarily the VR, the idea of VR needs to be tossed out. So that study, you could actually find some of their VR stuff on YouTube. And this was an image of some of the VR stuff that they used for that previous study, again, kind of helping people orient to real life situations that they may not really be encountering every day in the hospital setting or in a prison setting, for example. And so I think there's kind of this discussion of, what is the realness factor? So perhaps something like this doesn't feel real enough to people for them to feel truly present in the immersive situation. So depending on the quality of VR, it might not perform maybe any better than a standard role play exercise because it doesn't have that realness factor. So, maybe we just need to kind of get some better technology. We're also seeing tech in terms of training for individuals. So this is a headline that I think probably is an overemphasis of what is actually happening with this technology. It says how augmented reality will resolve the prison guard shortage crisis. I'm not sure that that's really kind of the implication here. And they're not arguing to use AI robots or anything like that to run prisons. The article just goes on to summarize how virtual reality is being used in parts of the UK. You're going to see more of these kinds of technologies are used outside the US, it seems. But they're using VR in the UK, that's what this article is talking about, to better train and prepare correctional staff by, again, providing them more immersive experiences about what to expect, how to handle assaultive behavior. Again, the idea being that better trained staff in the beginning, at the outset, will reduce burnout and turnover later on. So rather than learning these things on the job, maybe they can have a more immersive experience earlier and be better prepared. But again, we don't really know. This article doesn't say that it has, in fact, resolved the shortage crisis. So whether it can have those impacts is still unknown. So we don't know yet, but it seems logical, right? If we can do better training, we might have better outcomes later on. Okay, and this might also give way to training, for example, non-mental health staff like custody officers to be more therapeutic in certain ways to intervene and de-escalate. So there might be some ways that we can inject mental health goals in these kinds of training opportunities. This is a quote from, I don't know, you may or may not be paying attention to the APA Monitor on Psychology. Every year, they come out with a trends report. And for as long as I've been paying attention to the trends report, technology has been discussed in some capacity. And so I like this quote from the issue of the Monitor that came out just this month, actually. We're still in January. And this individual says there are complex trade-offs in AI's potential. It won't be all good or all bad. Fortunately, psychologists are accustomed to weighing complex trade-offs in their research and clinical work, so we are ready to meet this challenge, right? So I know AI is thinking about AI, especially in criminal legal context, might seem a bit scary, but I do think that this person is correct, that as psychologists, as mental health professionals, I think we are in a good position to weigh the pros and cons and to push technologies in a direction that will actually be helpful to people and not harmful, right? And really the bottom line is we can't stop this kind of technology from coming because it's already here. It's already it's already kind of in our lap. We can't close Pandora's box, as they say. So I think the questions then become, one, how do we leverage it to our advantage and the advantage of people in the criminal justice system and the broader public? And then how can we come together as a professional community to try to keep out the bad parts and try to, you know, filter in the things that, again, are going to be helpful? You know, obviously, I think we need to take some time to recognize that there are challenges and there are needs to be cautious about the application of technology. So I'll highlight a few challenges here. One, something that's been talked about a bit, and I've had conversations about this with other people as well, is that the development of technology can sometimes be too heavily focused on the tech side and less focused on the human side. So I did talk about a study, or I did present a paper earlier where they were really trying to involve incarcerated individuals in the development of VR technologies on the outset. But we need to do a better job of doing that. And really not allowing the technology to take over for us. When there is a focus on the human side, the implementation of new tech tends to focus on practitioner skills training. So do we as practitioners have the skills to implement the technology? And are we able to troubleshoot, problem solve? And there's less attention on making the organizational changes needed to really make the technology work. Again, the design aspects, or bringing in specific client issues. Okay, so we need to focus more on engaging other people in the design and development of these kinds of technologies. Another major problem that we have is that the scientific research tends to progress more slowly than technological advances. So sometimes by the time a program evaluation is approved, implemented, written up, submitted for publication, et cetera, something new is on the horizon, okay? And sitting here this morning, I don't really have great solutions for these kinds of things. The best I could think of would be, you know, something like, an expedited route or tailored support systems within universities or other agencies that are developing this kind of technology to expedite things like ethics approval and IP, you know, contracts and things like that. Those are the things that tend to slow this kind of work down, is trying to nail down the legal and the ethical aspects of things. So I don't know, maybe some kind of specialized IRB that would help us move these things more slowly. I've also had discussions about this with other people, that the tech really does have to be engaging enough or have some built-in mechanisms for ongoing participation. Otherwise, people are not going to keep doing it. I mean, if you think of any sort of health app that you might engage with, or something like Duolingo, right? Like what are the motivations that keep you engaged in those kinds of technologies? Or what is it that doesn't keep you engaged? What makes you bored with those things or moving on to something else? And I do think forensic and correctional settings are a good environment to build in participatory incentives, right? We just obviously need to be careful not to coerce people, and we want the tech to, even if it's new and we don't have you know, randomized control trials on it, we still want the tech to have some good theoretical and research backing before we put it into the field for people to use. And of course, tech costs money, and we have lots of financial and budgetary issues, particularly within forensic and correctional settings. And again, I don't have a great solution for how to get more money into these systems, but it's obviously a challenge that needs to be recognized. So a couple of the precautions, and again, I've emphasized empirical research before, but we desperately do need more empirical research. And again, not just whether people like it or think it's cool or that it's going to be revolutionary and all of that, but we really need to, you know, look at whether it actually does, you know, for example, reduce forensic wait lists. Can it reduce competency restoration times or times to release? Can it lead to accurate or less biased legal decision-making? Can it actually reduce reoffense behavior? Can it actually reduce staff burnout and turnover? Can it actually improve job attainment post-release? All of these kinds of things, right? Again, most of the available literature talks about, you know, practicalities of using technology, reports about perceptions or attitudes towards technology, or results from just kind of basic pilot testing that we need to build off of. Okay. And then, of course, there is the potential for misuse of technologies, right? I came across an article, again, while putting this presentation together, that questioned whether technology in corrections in particular was heading in the direction of a, quote, utopian vision of safe detention and rehabilitation, or a dehumanized and punitive dystopia, which I think is a bit of a dark way to look at things, but certainly there is the potential for misuse of technology, right? We're seeing lots of discussion about that in other areas. I mean, there was just a big thing the other week about AI generated pornographic images of Taylor Swift, and there's been talk about AI regulation from the federal level. So there's certainly misuse, opportunities for misuse here. But I happen to like this quote a little bit better. This was in another paper, and these authors said, to overcome the barriers and obtain the benefits, e-health has to have a good fit with patients and the forensic mental health context. It has to be seamlessly integrated in existing care and should not be added as an isolated element. To bridge the gap between the current situation and e-health's potential, further research on development, implementation, and evaluation should be conducted. So this to me felt like a more realistic and cautiously optimistic way of looking at technology. Okay. And then all this technology and talking about, you know, Kip et al. I don't know if you are familiar with Napoleon Dynamite. It kind of made me think of Kip and his love of technology. And he has a whole song in his wedding to LaFonda about how much he loves her, but he also really loves technology. So I just thought that was kind of a fun plug there. But anyway, moving on. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here in a minute or two, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what we as professionals can do to better embrace the progression of technology in psychology law services. So I want to kind of say to you to not be afraid of technology, but to be active in the engagement of technology. So one thing I think we could do a better job of as a profession is to kind of be up on the new trends in mental health tech, even if it's not specific to forensic or correctional psychology. Again, I've kind of found that our field is often lagging a bit from other mental health sectors in terms of what technologies are being used for mental health services. So that trends report that I talked about earlier would be a great article to browse and keep up on, just see what's going on in mental health tech. Playing a role in advocating the benefits and blocking harms. There's lots of misinformation out there about technology, but you know, technology also makes it easy for us to communicate with each other, you know, either by social media or other ways that we can use our voice to say, you know, this actually might be a good thing for our field. Or wait, we need to be more cautious about this kind of technology, and here's why. So playing that role in helping to raise your voice in terms of talking about benefits and potential harms for technology in our work. I talked about this, or I mentioned this at least a little bit earlier, not allowing the technology to take the lead. And with that, we need to balance and infuse technology with human and humane elements. So not allowing technology to replace us or do the work for us, but using technology as an aid and to improve the services that we give to people, or improve accessibility of services or the speed at which we can provide services. Start looking for ways to build technology into your daily practice, even if small and incremental. I'm not going to have time to really go over some of these tools, but towards the end of the presentation, I have a few tools that are either free or low cost kind of AI information summarizing type tools, or things that you could use to, you know, if you've got to review some case law, you could, you know, get a summary, or you can engage in an AI chat and ask specific questions about it. Like, what is this case about? What was the outcome of this case? Who was the defendant in this case? And it kind of saves you some time from reading those sort of things, but you can build it into your daily life, even if somewhat incrementally. Okay. if you don't know what you're doing, just Google it. I mean, you don't have to be any sort of techie to really get involved in this kind of stuff. I certainly am not a techie at all. If any of my students are on this call, or if you ask them at a conference, you know, they probably would think, what credentials does she even have to talk about this? She's always asking us to do stuff for her. So you don't have to be a techie to start integrating this or learn how to do it. You just have to be willing to watch a YouTube video about it. And again, lean into the existing literature. There's been quite a bit of work that's come out. Again, since I talked about this in 2022, there's stuff coming out all the time. One such thing that I wanted to point out is the recommendations for the use of telepsychology in psychology law and practice. This is a statement from the American Psychology Law Society, APLS Division 41 of APA. I co-chaired this task force with Michelle Guyton. This is a 3-year process, but this is a good set of recommendations, and it's available open access to everybody. So this came out somewhat recently in, I think it became open access around August of 2023. So we cover a couple different domains here: assessment, treatment, court communication. We talk about training, teaching and supervision. We talk about research. So you'll see some other ideas for future research in terms of topics to explore, dissemination, strategies, methodology when it comes to tech. And we don't really get into the ethics of things like ChatGPT or a lot of the virtual reality stuff, but I think, again, it gives some good guidance in a general sense about what to consider in terms of technology development. This is another good resource. I mentioned this special issue earlier in the presentation. This is just a screenshot of the introduction to the special issue, but this came out in criminal justice behavior, and there's a good, I happen to think, a good collection of articles here looking at some technological innovations for forensic and correctional mental health. And if anybody is interested in the virtual reality stuff, I found this set of guidelines for just using virtual reality in psychological research in general. So some of these, guidelines and guidance, I think, would be helpful. And I believe the APA telepsychology guidelines, the general guidelines for telepractice, are also due for revision. I believe they're working on that revised set of guidelines. So there should be an update to the 2013 guidelines at some point. So again, I'm not going to go through these, but these are just a couple tools that you might look into. Research Rabbit is really cool. They kind of describe it as like a Spotify for research. So if you're somebody who is an academic or you're a student out there, this would be maybe an interesting tool for you. I am going to skip ahead and just quickly show you slide deck, just because it has some relevance to an earlier slide. But slide deck is something that I found that was kind of cool, and you can upload a presentation and you can ask the AI tool something about this presentation. You can ask it to summarize the presentation. You can ask it who the presenter was. And so I uploaded, as I was preparing this talk, I uploaded my last talk from 2022, just to get a sense of how this tool worked, okay? And so I asked it to summarize this document for me. And this was the summary that it came up with. And if it sounds familiar, I took most of this summary and put it into the earlier slide where I, again, summarized my last talk. So everything you see in blue is what I copied and pasted from what AI told me that presentation was about. And I also asked it some other things like who presented. I asked it, should I use telepsychology in my practice? And it came up with a very psychology-esque response that essentially boiled down to it depends, but it had a pretty decent, insightful response to that question. This is another one, doc analysis. I think this is used a lot by attorneys. Again, I for the sake of example, I uploaded a Supreme Court case. This is the Kaler versus Kansas, and I asked it some questions about it. What did Kaler do? What was Kaler's defense? And it gave me some pretty good answers to that. And it also told me what pages it used to find those answers. And mind you, these answers to these questions were generated in a matter of seconds. So it really probably saved quite a bit of time in terms of reviewing these kinds of things. So again, you can find all sorts of tutorials about how to use these simple tools that, again, are either free or relatively inexpensive. And so I kind of want to end on just a funny note here, because I know that technology can be scary, it can be intimidating, and sometimes it can suck, as we've seen earlier where I wasn't able to show my video. But I wanted to end on kind of an upbeat note. I saw this tweet somewhat recently, and it's talking about an AI system that was designed to do something relatively benign, like distinguish different pastries to help expedite orders in a Japanese bakery. And it turned out that same technology was able to identify cancer cells. So again, there's good with the bad, but I think if we all participate in this, that we can move this in a positive direction that's going to be ultimately beneficial for us and the people that we serve in this field. Okay, so I've taken up enough of your time. This is the evaluation link. Anthony, I don't know how long you want me to have this displayed.
You can go ahead and leave that up for a bit now. The chat box also includes the link for anybody that wants to open up the survey there. But yes, thank you so much for that, Dr. Batastini, Ashley, for so much information here to cover, and including some plugs and demonstrations on some of these issues. Someone also commented on your excellent modeling during the Vice video earlier about how to manage a tech difficulty and doing that with poise. So
You just move on. That's what I've discovered.
We've all been there at this stage. So just moving on is definitely the way to go there. I am team doing work in the stretch pants with a dog near me myself. So I definitely relate to the experiences that you talked about.
Or people with children, I suppose that's a reason. But yeah, for me, it's my dog. I like being able to kind of have him laying under the table next to me.
Certainly. We have several people that have already asked questions. If you have any other questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. We'll do as best as we can to get to a couple of them right now. Some people, going on this AI part that you talked about here at the end, we had a couple of thoughts about, practical, but also potential ethical considerations in terms of, do you have any thoughts about the use of AI in forensic report writing, actually using it to do summaries? And then somebody added thoughts about using AI to, say, review records in the context of a medical evaluation, and any considerations or thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting conversation. I've had that conversation with some of my colleagues at the center, and because interestingly, we are situated in a university of technology. And so we have started to kind of talk about these things. And we even talked about a study looking at whether clinicians would be able to distinguish between a real report and one written by an AI tool. I think, yeah, there's certainly some potential for ethical considerations. And I think there has also been some articles that came out where attorneys were using these AI tools to review cases, and they ended up kind of reviewing things that were incorrect and whatnot. I think it kind of goes back to this point, is that we don't want to get to a point, which is hard to do when technology has such momentum. And I think we need to play a role in pulling things back so that the technology isn't taking over for us and isn't leading. So I think it's, from my perspective, I think it's certainly okay to use some of these tools as assistants, right? To maybe kind of get us started on things. And like the one tool I didn't get to show you the demo, but it'll be in the slides, is that Research Rabbit, which was kind of cool. Like it can sort of map out related articles and things like that. So using a tool like that to maybe collect case law that is relevant to the topic that you're looking at, and then that tool also will help you it'll pull the abstracts of things. I think, we still have to review those things. So even if you're using an AI tool to help you summarize or get you started or build a library or collection of things to review, you can't take the human element away from these things. And I realize that it's hard to prevent other people from doing that kind of thing or relying, it can be kind of a slippery slope, I guess. And I certainly wouldn't at this stage recommend that you rely on AI to write your entire report and then just blindly submit it to the court. I think that would probably be pretty bad practice.
Certainly, yes.
Yes, but using it to be proofread or maybe there's something in particular that you're struggling to articulate, but then of course reviewing that and making sure that it makes sense before somebody's life is impacted by what you're saying.
And a couple of people have asked questions about implications broadly in terms of accessibility issues. Someone said, can you speak to the tension between our enthusiasm of adopting more tech for efficiency and then the lack of adequate funding to provide tech support? When it then breaks, efficiency then really becomes lost.
Yeah, it is sort of a struggle, and I think that it's something that probably should have been on that slide about challenges that we do struggle in terms of the funding for things, which also does include those support services. And I don't know if I have a great answer for that other than to try to help advocate for budgetary changes in your agency or to brainstorm ways that you could carve out individuals or bring in individuals or hire somebody whose job it is to help support those technologies that you want to implement. And of course, that depends on what technologies you want to implement. I mean, if it's just kind of a video conferencing system like Zoom to improve the efficiency of your evaluations, that might require less tech savviness or tech support than, bringing in a virtual reality tool to do those kinds of things. And I wish that was something that I looked into a bit more in preparing for this presentation. But again, it's some of the initiatives that are going on, especially in other parts of the world. It might be kind of worth looking at. Okay, well, how did they get these things implemented? How did they get the funding for it? So, and like in New South Wales, I don't know where they're getting the funding for this, but they have it somewhere. So, and they have these calls out to do that kind of work. So yeah, that probably isn't the most helpful answer. But it could be another way that as professionals, we try to get our hands dirty a little bit and figure out, okay, well, what can we do? How can we get somebody on board that can better help us with the implementation element of these things and the maintenance of it?
Yeah, and then at the individual level, do you foresee tech literacy being a potential barrier for people who might otherwise be good candidates for tech psych intervention? Or do you find that web-based, say, competency restoration or intervention programs are broadly user-friendly enough that they don't require advanced computer literacy or lots of previous exposure to the technology?
Yeah, so training, and this isn't quite this question, but training is something that we've been talking a lot about on the Tech Advisory Committee on the professional side of things. So again, this kind of goes back to this point that we tend to focus on professional training, but making sure that us as professionals have some literacy about technology, because that could then maybe be used to help our clients, or at least have some way of helping them navigate any kind of troubleshooting that they might have in terms of logging on to Zoom and using VR. But I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the population that we're dealing with, like, again, if you get a chance to watch that Vice video, those guys are going to talk about how they really don't have any exposure to technology. They've been incarcerated so long, or maybe they've been in the hospital so long that they really haven't had a chance to understand these things or play around with them before, but it's not necessarily becoming a barrier for them that, once they put the thing on their face or once they kind of get a little bit of training and exposure to it. I mean, think about it. I don't know if you've ever played a video game or anything like that, or, when you first start playing with it, you're really slow at where the controls are located. And then all of a sudden, it's just, you're doing it naturally. I mean, I used to play Super Mario Brothers 3 and, you know, a long time ago, but I can't remember the last time I played that, but if I pick up that stupid little retro controller, I can get right back into it. So it just kind of takes maybe some patience and a little bit of time to, you know, assist people that you're working with to feel comfortable in doing this. And it might even be worthwhile to do like a brief assessment on the forefront of, have you had any exposure to this kind of technology before? How comfortable do you feel? And just using some of our basic therapeutic skills to help people feel more confident and capable of engaging in the technologies. I mean, again, the things that I'm talking about today are being used with people who, for the most part, have fairly low tech literacy to begin with.
So just perhaps like a lot of intervention things coming at it with a, you know, a psycho intervention and making things, you know, approachable at the beginning, seeing where people come from being particularly key there to making it ultimately accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that might start with doing a better job of training us as professionals at the beginning to kind of work through those issues. But yeah, that's something we've been talking about on the health advisory board, is how can we get graduate programs to, you know, have more standard training when it comes to technology and service delivery.
Going off of the AI conversation, what about confidentiality issues in terms of using AI, potential user agreements where it, you know, plugs in and uses your data to advance AI further, confidentiality considerations of reviewing records or using in report writing?
You mean like confidentiality of patient records and things like that?
Right. Yeah.
Or like using people's names in reports. Yeah, I would just check the quality of the text. Some of this technology is HIPAA compliant. So I would certainly recommend using tools that either are HIPAA compliant or that you can get, you know, a HIPAA compliant version of it. Zoom, for example. I mean, we do Zoom evaluations or Zoom services. And so making sure that we're using the HIPAA compliant version of technologies, and that's certainly available out there. I mean, we have, you know, electronic medical records and things like that. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue. You just want to be careful and make sure that you're using a, you know, a recommended health platform that has those built-in protections.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley. You've given us so much to consider here, and a lot of practical information, links, specific kind of technology things for us to peruse and see where we might be able to use this in our services, or just other questions that we need to ask further. A lot of it can seem initially scary at first, but as we've seen with telehealth, it feeling increasingly comfortable, increasingly approachable. So thank you so much for that wealth of knowledge there.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week when Dr. Sarah Millspaw will be talking about using and administrating symptom validity tests for people that are suspected of having low intellectual functioning. Until then, we hope you have a fantastic rest of the week and take care.